Hello, good day, everyone. Jay Devers here. Welcome to a quick review of the changes in Incoterms that go into effect on the 1st of January 2020. Let's jump in. For those of you who I have not met, my name is Jay Devers, and I am the managing partner of Bestway International. We are an international freight forwarder and U.S. customs broker established in Kansas City, Missouri in 1988. We have also been partners with Hellman Worldwide Logistics since 2005. Today's agenda, this is a very brief presentation. We're going to talk about Incoterms quickly, really focus on what's changed in the 2020 edition. I'm guessing that's what most of you are here for. A couple of tips on how to use the any mode terms. What we're not going to do today is talk about the history of Incoterms, get into the definitions, and any sort of deep dives into best practices or the ocean transport only terms. Incoterms. So these sets of international business rules have been around since 1936. There's currently 11 different terms that define the risks and responsibilities of shipments and deliveries. Incoterms is a property of the International Chamber of Commerce. They're written and negotiated in English with 27 different translations and are endorsed by over 130 international chambers of commerce. What we know Incoterms to exist for is to define and divide the cost, risks, and responsibilities of the parties. In our world, we say that a working knowledge and command of Incoterms is critical to great, successful, repeat international transactions, because when everybody knows what's going to happen and no one is surprised, that's a key to customer satisfaction. Very important. The Incoterms are always 3 letters followed by a name place. This is one area where we see people get sloppy, is that they will go with an Incoterm and leave the name place blank, which almost entirely invalidates the use of the term. So definitely, as you think about Incoterms, make sure that the 3 letters are followed by a name place, and the name place can be as specific as you want it to be, right down to a physical address or a dock door at a physical address. Real brief history of Incoterms. We are discussing the 2020 changes. The pattern of the last 30 years is that the terms have been revised around every 10 years. Don't necessarily expect that to continue, but as it has happened, we've looked at some pretty significant revisions to Incoterms the last 20 years. This particular change in terms, you may argue otherwise, but doesn't seem real significant to me, and that's why this presentation won't be very long. So why do we use these Incoterms? We want both parties to an international transaction to understand what's going on, to understand who's responsible for what. So we're dividing the costs of the transaction, the risks, primarily of loss, and the responsibilities between the sellers and the buyers. We want to reduce the opportunity for a misunderstanding. We want to make sure each party knows what their costs are so they can factor that into the price of the product or the price of the product that they're buying, obviously. And as I mentioned a second ago, knowledge of Incoterms is a major strategic advantage for those who understand them and use them properly. What we want to do quickly here is we want to talk about strictly the changes in Incoterms 2020. What we're going to focus in on is the delivery element and the responsibility element of assigning risk. We're going to explain the demarcation points, and we're going to talk briefly about how those apply to sales contracts, and the emphasis is going to be on making Incoterms easier to use and helping both parties understand the terms. When you look at the process of this update to Incoterms, you really see the people involved trying to make things easier and make it just a more practical tool to use in international trade. Take complexity and take friction out of using these terms. You'll be the judge of how successful that is. So let's jump right in and talk about what's new in Incoterms 2020. So first of all, DAT, delivered at terminal, is renamed to DPU, delivered at place, unloaded. Really what we're talking about here is terminal becoming place. There's no practical change in this term, and the reason for the change is that there was a lot of demand for people to indicate a name place and basically give themselves more flexibility than being combined to a terminal. So really not a big change here, but this change alone makes everyone's Incoterms 2010 charts obsolete. The second change comes to FCA and also FOB, if time would allow. But FCA is free carrier, and there's some new clarification in this term that involves the handling of the bill of lading. Specifically, what we're talking about here is the bill of lading for the pre-carriage or the inland freight. If you recall that FCA is what you could call a collect Incoterm if you're an exporter. So the exporter, shipper, seller, let's say, is typically not involved in arranging any freight. This takes them out of the span of control of having a bill of lading to prove that the product moved. And so there's some new language in the FCA term that indicates that, in fact, it encourages the bill of lading to be shared from the seller to the buyer, so both parties have a copy of that bill of lading. Next, the insurance terms, CIP and CIF. So what we're doing here with the changes in this term is we're being more specific as it relates to the type of coverage that is required when you use these terms. So diving a little deeper, CIP moves from Clause C of the Institute of Cargo Clauses, which is essentially a limited risk insurance clause, to Clause A, which is an all-risk clause, subject to inclusions. Of course, there's the small print. Well, now, why are we doing this? Well, what's happened is people have used these terms, and these terms are very heavily used, is that we have found that CIF, being an ocean-only term, lends itself more to bulk cargo. So think about agricultural products, liquid products like fuel, grain, things of that nature. CIP, which is the multimodal term, really lends itself more to containerized freight. And what you have in those containers is typically more manufactured goods, and those goods are higher value. So what we've done is we've indicated in here that CIP will be an all-risk insurance policy, and CIF remains a limited risk insurance policy. So what's happening here basically is we're just getting a little bit more specific on the type of insurance that is implied when you use these terms. A couple more changes. The list of responsibilities has been reordered, and I believe this is the first time this list has changed in probably 20 years at least. But the list has been reordered, it's been improved, and it's been simplified. So instead of having to bounce around this list of 10 different responsibilities, it provides a very nice, tight, sequential, one-stop list of costs for each term. And if you've had a chance to look at the Incoterms handbook, you see that great length has been taken to make sure that the costs are understood and accounted for. So the list flows a lot more clearly, and if you are finding yourself in a position to need to look things up, they're a little easier to find because they're more in a natural order of a transaction. So this is pretty cool. The next thing is you're starting to see more clarity on language for the security requirements for both the seller and the buyer. What's going on here, obviously, is the world that we live in has changed quite a bit in the last 20 years. Security filings are a huge part of international transportation and international trade compliance. And what we all know is if they're not done on time or if they're not done properly, you've added the risk of delay and potentially expense to the transactions. So the language you see in this area is primarily oriented towards both parties working together to make sure that the security filings are done in a timely fashion. As we get to the end of the changes for 2020, There is some new language in there, and you see this primarily in FCA, FOB, where the seller or the buyer uses their own transportation. What has been found in prior iterations of Incoterms is it's kind of assumed that either the buyer or the seller uses a carrier who is a third party. They hire a truck is the best example. And as it's evolved, it's become more clear that a lot of sellers and buyers use their own transportation. And so this language in the terms basically calls out that the party can contract or arrange at its own cost for carriage and doesn't assume that a third-party carrier is involved. Last but not least, as we look into the terms changes for 2020, you'll find that the back of the reference guides have taken the explanatory notes and changed them into guidance notes. Now, this sounds like a semantic change, but this is one of the areas where the language has really been cleaned up, really been simplified, and not been so lawyerly or so legalese and so difficult to understand, especially for professionals in this space who are really looking for a quick answer and don't have time to read a small novel when they need to help with a situation. So this is a very positive change. That is a very high-level recap of the changes. I think you may agree with me that based on expectations coming into this change in Incoterms, that this is rather underwhelming. The changes are nowhere near as pervasive as thought they would be going into this change, which revealed itself in September of 2019. So wrapping up my comments, just to point out for those of you who may not be familiar with Incoterms, there are 11 terms total. The terms you see on the left are what are considered any mode terms. They are applicable to any mode of transportation. So think more than just steamship lines, airplanes, but think about trucks, rail, all sorts of different methods of transferring goods. The 4 terms on the right are confined to marine-only transportation, and that's because the specifics of the responsibility elements in these terms, most notably delivery, are very, very proprietary to ocean transportation. So one of the things that we recommend considering is don't even worry about those 4, because you can use the 7 on the left and be in equally good shape. This is a really quick look at the changes that I mentioned earlier about the seller and buyer responsibility areas. This is a look at how things used to be under Incoterms 2010, and I think well before. You can tell by looking at this that this doesn't exactly flow like a transaction flows. So let's take a real quick look at the new order. The new order is a lot more in line with the flow of how things go. A indicates the seller, B indicates the buyer, and we've cleaned up the risks and responsibilities to make them a lot easier to reference and hopefully easier for you to use. A tip that you'll hear from us, you'll hear from Frank Reynolds, you'll hear from many people, is to avoid the bookends. So let's say that you have standardized on the 7 terms. There are some very, very specific reasons to not use XWorks and not use DDP unless you have a good case to do that. Not to say that you should ban the use of those terms, just know that those terms require an extra step or 2 of understanding before you jump in and use those, because you might be signing yourself up, whether you're the buyer or the seller, for more risk and more responsibility than you want. So tip number 1 of 2 is avoid the bookends if you can. And tip number 2 of 2 is let's try to standardize on 1 term for collect business if you are an exporter and 1 term for prepaid business if you are an exporter. The terms that we recommend highly are FCA for collect and CIP for prepaid. This These are terms that are very commonly used, very well understood, and you will find that will bring you minimal confusion. Speaking on the exporter's perspective in the prepaid term, CIP is a fantastic term because you have control. Many trainers will say C stands for control, and they're not wrong. You will have the insurance and risk obligation covered, and covered to the standards that we mentioned a few minutes ago. And you will be able to control the handoff point by defining the name place that follows this term. So there's not a lot of downside of using CIP for your prepaid Incoterm if you are an exporter. If you are an importer, I apologize right now for this set of comments being exporter oriented. Simply reverse everything I just said and apply that to importing, and works just the same. Good resources for you to use. Contact one of us or visit our website and grab one of our handy Incoterms 2020 charts. These not only are really handy to check out areas of responsibility, but they also are colorful and will brighten up your office. Other excellent resources. The Incoterms 2020 handbook is fantastic, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. Very easy to use, tabbed in a nice way, and a lot of the comments have been simplified for quick reference. The other book, if you want to get a little deeper into it, is Incoterms for Americans by Frank Reynolds, who is the U.S. delegate to Incoterms for the last over 30 years and widely regarded as the subject matter expert for Incoterms in the United States. This is a terrific book. Both of these resources are a little pricey. I think $50 or $60 a piece, but very, very handy to have around. Thank you for your attention. We appreciate you taking a few minutes of your day to dive into Incoterms and specifically the changes in Incoterms. Please see our website or one of us. We do have a far more thorough Incoterms training. Reminder, this set of training was specifically oriented towards quickly highlighting the 2020 changes. So thank you again for your business. We appreciate you, and thank you for trusting us with your cargo and this very valuable relationship.